The nuclear experiments could cost experts millions of dollars and years to accomplish. But this teenager managed to do it using items like smoke detectors, clocks, gas lanterns, and other random household supplies. And he was only 17. That's how he earned the nickname Radioactive Boy Scout. In 1995, in a small Michigan town, a group of men in hazmat suits arrived with electric saws. They started tearing apart a potting shed, throwing the debris into steel drums plastered with radioactive warning signs. The townspeople had no idea what was happening until they learned the shed was dangerously radioactive. Even worse, the town's 40,000 residents might have been exposed. So who was behind it all? It's 17-year-old David Hahn. David's life wasn't exactly stable. His parents divorced when he was little, so David ended up bouncing between homes. It made him pretty quiet and withdrawn. When he was 10, his step-grandfather gave him a book called The Golden Book of Chemistry Experiments, and everything changed. David fell in love with chemistry. After school, he'd run home to do experiments. These experiments were often dangerous. There were spills, explosions, and even hospital visits for injuries. But nothing could stop him. By 12, David joined the Boy Scouts. With help from his teachers, he drew a diagram of how nuclear fission works and even built a model reactor using stuff like a juice can, coat hangers, soda straws, kitchen matches, and rubber bands. That helped him earn the Atomic Energy Merit Badge. But David wasn't satisfied. His dream was to build a real breeder reactor. It wasn't just about his love for chemistry. He was thinking big. One of these days, we're going to run out of oil. I want to do something about it. To make it happen, he pretended to be a physics teacher and wrote to various organizations, asking for info on how to obtain radioactive materials. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission became David Hahn's biggest helper. David's extensive knowledge of chemistry made them never suspected he was just a 15-year-old kid at that time. They gave him everything he needed, like tips on isolating radioactive elements, a list of isotopes that could sustain a chain reaction, and even pricing and sources for radioactive materials. Once David had the info, his next mission was gathering the materials. From a Boy Scouts atomic energy booklet, David figured out some radioactive materials confined from household supplies. Like americium was in smoke detectors, radium in old luminous dial clocks, uranium in pitchblende, and thorium in Coleman gas lanterns. So he bought 100 broken smoke detectors for $1 each, collected many antique clocks, and scrounged up anything else he needed. He even brought a Geiger counter to supermarkets, scanning products for radiation. If something registered as radioactive, he'd buy it in bulk and bring it home. Then came the scary part, extracting the radioactive elements. Since his earlier chemistry experiments at his father's house had led to frequent explosions, his dad banned him from conducting any more experiments there. So, David moved his nuclear experiments to his mother's backyard garden shed. And the most crazy thing was David didn't use any proper safety precautions. He worked with nothing more than gloves and a basic mask. But as his experiments went on, the radiation levels in the backyard got insane, 1,000 times higher than normal background radiation. That's when it hit David. He was way out of his depth. So he tore everything apart and tried to figure out how to get rid of the radioactive materials without anyone noticing. He planned to bury everything at night, but his sketchy behavior made a neighbor think he was stealing tires. So the neighbor called the cops. When police searched his car trunk, they found over 50 foil-wrapped cubes of mysterious gray powder, along with chemicals and acids. At first, they thought it was an atomic bomb. Eventually, the government realized the materials were radioactive. David's mom panicked, worried the authorities would take her house because of his experiments. So she tore through the shed and threw most of the stuff away, but she didn't know all the things were dangerously radioactive. In the end, the government spent $60,000 cleaning up the backyard. The remains of his experiments were shipped off to a radioactive waste site in Utah. Tragically, the stress of it all was too much for David's mom. She finally took her own life. David became known as the Radioactive Boy Scout, but the nickname didn't help his social life. People were scared of him and started avoiding him. One time, his girlfriend brought some balloons he gave her to school, but the principal freaked out and confiscated them, thinking they might be filled with chemical gases. Eventually, the feds shut down David's lab for good. After serving in the military, David came back home, and, no surprise, he started thinking about nuclear experiments again. At one point, he even tried to steal a bunch of smoke detectors to get americium out of them. There's a photo of him after his arrest. His face was covered in sores, and people thought it might have been from long-term exposure to radioactive materials. But in 2016, David's story took a tragic turn. He was found dead. That's the story of David Hahn. Some people said he was evil, because he put an entire town at risk by conducting nuclear experiments at home without caring about anyone's safety. But others said he was a genius who just needed proper guidance. Despite everything, David was a good person. Even now, people who knew him still leave comments on videos about him, saying he was a kind and loyal friend who will always hold a place in their hearts. Thank you for watching, and subscribe please.